One of the most defining moments of the past 12 months of my life involved an Argos catalogue and a chocolate mousse. I was with Charlie, and for the first time it was just him and I. Charlie has cerebral palsy. His movement's very limited. His speech is slow and often unclear. And in fact, it was one slow dinner time. It was always slow. I'd gone to the fridge to look what there was for pudding, and Charlie was there just thumbing through his favourite Argos catalogue. I said to him, "Hey Charlie, would you like some chocolate mousse for your pudding?" And I got no reply. I asked again, a little bit annoyed at his lack of manners. And still nothing. I asked a third time, this time eyebrows patronisingly raised. "Charlie, would you like some chocolate mousse for your pudding?" And at last he replies, "Sam, can I afford these headphones?" Sometime later, I divert his attention away from the Argos catalogue, and he decides he'd like some chocolate mousse. And I remember, as I was supporting him to take his first teaspoonful of that pudding, and just watching and waiting as he slowly savoured it, a painful realisation hit me. I couldn't bear the slowness of what was happening. I remember my body had physically tensed up, and it almost felt as if I was being tugged backwards. I was sharing life with someone who was living at a disruptive pace. Now, that experience continues to form me, and to be honest, the slowness of life in our community hasn't become much more comfortable to me. But I am learning about life with God through my discomfort. That God's love is always slow. Matthew's gospel reveals this extraordinary secret, which is that those perceived as weak in our world, the little ones as it calls them, possess a uniquely clear vision of God in his kingdom. Matthew chapter 11 says that the wise and learned will fail to grasp God's judgment and the timing of God's judgment. But Jesus is heartened in Matthew chapter 11 verse 25 that the little ones seem to get it. The idea complements the Apostle Paul's understanding of salvation, who talks about Jesus embracing the weakness of the cross in order to reveal God. And so I wonder if in our day, those perceived as weak in our world might be what liberation theologian John Sobrino calls a mysterious locus for salvation. It is among those perceived as weak in our world where God continues to feel most at home. And that is where disability and theology meet. I don't think that the God-human relationship has ever been described more intensely than in the language of covenant. And ancient Israel, a weak nation in the ancient Near East, imagines its covenant relationship to God as being profoundly slow. What do I mean by that? Take the covenant made with Abraham, for example. It constitutes Israel's national identity, and it promises this vast royal ancestry that will take centuries to be delivered, however you look at it. And after that ancestral covenant is made, Abraham is told his only son must die. It's as though Abraham and Israel itself are being tugged backwards. Later on in Israel's story, the hope of an anointed one bound up in the Davidic covenant comes to reach its climax centuries later in the advent of Jesus. And yet first Judah will be exiled to Babylon, and the Davidic dynasty will be brought to this devastating halt. Again, a tug backwards. Or St. Paul, for example, he struggles to comprehend the slowness of God's new covenant. And in fact, you can read it in 1 Thessalonians, Paul's earliest extant letter. He imagines that he's going to be whisked away to heaven in his own lifetime. Nice try, Paul. Again, there is a tug backwards. Spiritually speaking, then, I think the pace of modern life, with our exponentially increasing levels of connectivity, is actually nothing unique. In fact, we're in saintly company when we feel frustrated by the disruptive slowness of God's work with us. William Albright is among the Old Testament scholars to have noticed the etymological connection between the Hebrew word for covenant, berit, and the Akkadian word bertu, which refers to a shackle or a chain or a bond. Perhaps then we can say that somewhere in Israel's conception of its covenant relationship to God was the sense of being chained and tugged into a slower and holier way of relationship. God's covenant love is always slow, but it permits great tenderness. Steve is a man with Down syndrome in our community who is living at God's pace. And Steve loves chocolate brownie Saturday. In fact, there's as much celebration and joy in his 100th reminder to himself on a Saturday morning that today is the day he will be eating a chocolate brownie, as there is when the pudding actually arrives. The slowness with which he is at ease is permitting him to savor good things with tenderness and joy. Or David, another member of our community with a learning disability, who keeps himself busy with many things, woodwork, music, and much more. And yet he's not so hurried that he won't be gladly interrupted by the offer from a friend or from a stranger of a hand to clasp his own around. He's living outside a world whose relentless pace has made most of us too embarrassed to stop and ask to be touched. The church is enriched by those at the margins who understand that love is always slow. In fact, we'll receive the tenderness of God's kingdom from them. It's ironic that many slurs have sought to ridicule the slower way of relationship with which many people with learning disabilities are at ease. Stanley Hauerwas, a writer on theology and disability, might describe those slurs as the product of modernity, whose cherishing of ideals like independence and autonomy has actually helped shape a narrative of loss and deprivation around the subject of learning disability. And yet, to be tugged backwards into the slow, tender life of God is truly rich. It's to receive hospitality without making excuses. It's to miss appointments because we've over-enjoyed things. It's even to appreciate why prayer can be so awkward and strained. And perhaps for those of us whose lives are marked by the familiar peace of a slow covenant with God, it's to have your life abruptly halted by a pandemic and not feel compelled to call the feeling strange. Because divine love that is kind, patient, persevering is always slow.